But we're going to talk a bit of F1 now, and a new book, Grand Prix, an illustrated history of Formula One, by a very familiar face and voice from Drive to Survive, a journalist and broadcaster, Will Buxton. Good afternoon, Will.
Good afternoon. How you doing, guys?
Good, thank you. Yeah, your book, it's an illustrated history, as we said, of Formula One, and I think it's going to serve a real purpose for so many people that have come into the sport in recent years, mainly through, you would probably say, Drive to Survive, that aren't really steeped in the history. And you've done a little kind of 400-word pen picks of all the greats, taking you right back to the days of Fangio.
Yeah, there's this mad statistic that came out last year, which is that 1 in 3 people watching Formula One have been watching for less than 5 years. And the total global audience now, something like 1.5 billion people in 180 territories. So I wanted to do something that spoke to this huge swathe of new fan, because I mean, you know what it's like when we're trying to tell the story of sport. It doesn't matter what sport we're talking about. You always try to bring context through talking about the past. And Formula One is such a complex sport and always has been, and I think has been kind of seen as quite difficult to get into, because there's so much assumed knowledge that those who love the sport or those who broadcast the sport just naturally think everybody has. But if people have been watching for less than 5 years, they never saw Michael Schumacher race, let alone anybody before that, like an Ayrton Senna or an Alain Prost, or, as you say, going back to the 1950s and guys like Fangio. So if we're comparing a Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen with some of the all-time greats, how do you teach somebody who's only been watching a few years who these greats are, where they came from, what they achieved? Because it's such a rich history in this sport. But I just felt at times it was a bit too complex. It'd been made a bit too difficult for people to get into. So I wanted to do something that opened it up, didn't gatekeep, just made it more accessible, particularly for new fans.
It's interesting because we often hear that young people aren't interested in history, but presumably you found they are.
I think when we talk in sport so much about the greats, to bring context to what's happening today, if you don't teach people who they are, then it's very difficult for them to understand why we're talking about them. Like let's say it's football and you're just getting into football right now. How do you know who Maradona is or Pele is unless somebody tells you? You can throw their names out there as much as you want, but if you get a 10-year-old watching football for the first time, they're like, well, I recognize the names, but I don't know anything about them. I've never seen them play. So I wanted to go back to bring context to it. And also because, on social media these days, people will fall in love with a sport or a team, and they may go online and they may find it's quite a difficult place to be, because people will immediately dismiss them and say, oh, well, you're a new fan. You don't know anything. How do you know anything unless someone takes you by the hand and takes you on a guided tour? We all had our first game. Whatever sport it is we love, we all had a day where we knew nothing. The most experienced journalists in the world, no matter the game they're covering, no matter what stadium they're standing at, they had a day where they knew nothing, where they were totally new to it. And I kind of wanted to go back to my days as a kid or as a new fan growing up with the sport and think, well, what did I not know? What did I want to know? And hopefully this will go some way to easing that path of entry to what can at times, I know, seem like quite a complicated sport to get into.
So what was your gateway into the sport, Will? Who was the driver that sort of inspired you to get into it?
Senna. Senna was my hero when I was a kid. Just something mesmerizing about watching him drive that car on track. But I fell in love with motor racing when I was like 4 years old. My parents took me to the Prescott Hill Climb, and I would just fell in love with the smell of it and the sound of it, and just how exciting it and dangerous it all felt. I didn't get to go to a Grand Prix till I was in my teens, and we could only afford to do like a practice day back then. And but I just loved it. I love cars. I loved the excitement, the thrill, I think it was just the terrifying aspect of it as well, and the fact that these amazing heroes could jump into these cars and do something otherworldly with them. And it's still why I respect and revere the racing drivers today, because they do this thing that I wish I could do. It's something so special, so unique.
I think people would be, if the people that have come to the sport late, if they read your book and they just read the amount of great drivers you talk about in the book. I'm sure Jim Clark's in there and others that died. Yeah. And it's never going to be a completely safe sport.
It's so much
safer. But it's so much safer than it was. And I think they would be quite shocked by the amount of greats that were lost along the way.
Well, this is it, you know, and as you say, I've tried to sort of condense careers down into about 400 words, so it's like a 2-3 minute read, nothing too big, nothing too scary. And I thought I was really going to struggle with the guys that I didn't meet or that I never saw race. But actually, their careers were in many ways easier to condense into that period because they were so short, be it because the regulations changed and their skill set was no longer good enough for the new cars, or quite simply because they didn't survive the era. You compare that to today and a driver like Lewis, who's been there for a decade and a half, or Fernando Alonso, who's been there for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
That's a much harder career to cram into 400 words. But yeah, it was dangerous, but that danger still remains. The other week, or the other day, in fact, it was only 10 years since the accident which ultimately claimed Jules Bianchi at the Japanese Grand Prix, and that still lingers very much in everyone's minds. And so many of the safety processes and innovations we've seen on the Formula One cars, like the Halo, came about as a direct result of that accident. It will never be safe. They will always take their lives in their hands every time they get into the cockpits, and it's something that I think sets these drivers as sportsmen and women really apart from so many others. That the risk taking is still a hugely significant part of this sport.